Welcome back to the Zero Carbon Futures Pavilion hosted by the Clean Air Task Force. My name is Jonathan Banks. I'm the Global Director for the Methane Pollution Prevention Program at CATF, and really excited for this next panel on methane called Measure and Manage, How Science and Data Can Spur Action to Cut Methane Emissions. So I'm really thrilled to have some friends and colleagues here on this panel. Starting on this end, Dan Grossman is the Associate Vice President for Energy Transition at Environmental Defense Fund. And then we have Mackenzie Huffman from Carbon Mapper. She's the Director of Strategic Partnerships. And then last but not least, Laura Hutchinson from RMI, who's the Manager of Climate Aligned Industries. And we're going to be talking a lot about data and tools and some really cool stuff that is starting to change how we look at methane emissions and starting to drive action around the world. I have often mistakenly said in the world of methane that the solutions we're talking about aren't rocket science, but in the case of this panel, there actually is a lot of rocket science involved, and so that's really exciting because everybody loves rockets. Kate is having a heart attack right now. Sorry, Kate. All right, so first things first, though, the reason we're here to talk about methane is a global warming pollutant. It's a short-lived climate pollutant that's 80 times more powerful than CO2 over the first 20 years of its lifetime in the atmosphere. And of course, methane emissions are the one and only thing that we can do to slow down the rate of warming and to see near-term reductions in all of our lifetimes of the warming that we are feeling. Currently, methane emissions are responsible for about 0.5 degree of global warming out of the 1.2 degrees that we're feeling. And if we reduce emissions, we can see a really huge benefit. A 40 to 45% cut in methane emissions by 2030 would knock off 0.3 degrees Celsius, which is a massive, massive benefit to climate. So one of the things that we face in the world of, I should have been there first. Sorry, there we go. One of the things that we face in the world of methane pollution prevention is a barrier to getting countries, getting governments, getting companies to move forward on policies and measures that will start cutting the methane emissions. In fact, the very first question that you face often when you start a conversation with these policymakers and actors is, we have no idea how much we emit, so how in the world are we supposed to cut our emissions? And so today's panel is really about overcoming that barrier. It's not creating perfect data. There is no such thing as perfect data in the methane world. It's about getting people past that first barrier and moving them to action to reduce methane emissions, okay? So I'm going to start off today talking a little bit about some of the work that CATF has been doing, talking about a tool that we built called COMAT, which is the Country Methane Abatement Tool. I've already talked about this, but skipping my own slides. So the slides here, for those of you who don't know optical gas imaging, all the images there on your right are optical gas imaging pictures from oil and gas sites. Methane's invisible, you can't see it. It's only with cameras like these that you can see it from the ground, and other types of tools where you can see it from satellites and airplanes. So I've already talked about this, so I'm going to skip over that. So COMAT, again, when you start talking with policymakers, most of the time they have no idea how much emissions are coming out of the oil and gas sector, the waste sector, the ag sector, or whatever. That's a huge barrier, but it doesn't have to end there. So we developed a tool. It's essentially a very complex spreadsheet model that builds on data that many countries and many companies have. It moves countries past this barrier by using what we call activity data and equipment counts. So this is literally how many wells do you have? How many compressors do you have? What type of compressor is it? How many kilometers of pipeline do you have? What the size of that pipeline is? How much gas is flowing through it? All of these things. These are things that most countries and definitely most companies can find when they start searching around for their data. It sometimes takes quite a bit of time for them to find it, which is a little bit surprising, but they do have this data. And by using that data combined with improved emission factors, we are able to get a better picture, not a perfect picture, but a better picture of what emissions look like in that country, and to really start them moving past that barrier of we don't know how much we emit, so how can we reduce our emissions? Thus far, COMAT's been used in just a few places. We've been working in a number of countries in Latin America as well as in Africa with COMAT. In Colombia, who became the first country to finalize methane regulations earlier this year, we worked with the Colombian government, the Ministry of Mines and Energy, to help them get a better understanding of what their methane emissions might look like, and specifically where the methane emissions are likely coming from based on their equipment counts and their inventory of equipment. We also did a similar bit of work in Ecuador, where they haven't finished their methane regulations yet, although they just finalized flaring regulations, and we're working closely with them on those. But they're headed towards hopefully issuing methane regulations probably early next year is our hope. Also in Nigeria, which became the first African country to regulate methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, we worked with Nigeria to help them first understand, what the sources of emissions are likely in Nigeria, and then what they could achieve through some of the best practices around the world that might be able to be deployed in Nigeria's oil and gas system. They then incorporated that into their NDC, 60% reduction in fugitive emissions by 2031. And they just last week finalized their methane regulations for the oil and gas sector to take the target of the NDC and translate that into domestic policy. So that was pretty exciting as well. We're in the process right now of completely redoing COMAT, and that's because complicated spreadsheets are definitely not for everyone. If I opened up COMAT for you, unless you really, really geek out on Excel, it would probably scare you to death. It scares me every time I open it, so I try to avoid it like the plague. So what we're trying to do is make people like me happy to play around with it. If you're an American and you do your taxes, hopefully you do your taxes, you've probably played around with TurboTax, unless you're really wealthy and you have an accountant that can take care of that. If you played around with TurboTax, you know what I'm talking about. That's what we're trying to get at. We're trying to get at something where you are asked a question, and it's a basic question that you can figure out an answer, and you can modify the inputs to come up with take a complicated problem and turn it into a much more simple pathway forward. So that's what we're in the process of doing. It will also build on what we have been doing in the past with COMAT 1.0, which was essentially emission calculations and estimates and then mitigation planning, but then build on that to create a tool that has a lot of collaboration, industry resources, as well as a policy library so that policymakers can dig in and figure out, okay, what has the rest of the world done on this, and what then I can do? How can I take what Canada did or Colombia did or Nigeria did and modify it from my own country so that I don't have to start at square one? The next few slides are going to just give you a sense of what this is going to look like when it's done. There will be a dashboard where countries will start off with some basic inputs where they'll be able to see like their currently estimated emissions from the tool. But that's just the start. Everything is modifiable by the country. They'll go in, they'll start putting in the miles of pipe, or the kilometers of pipeline they have, the types of compressors, the what their gas transmission and storage system looks like. Everything that they can get in here, they can put in here and modify. If they don't have the data, there's standard values that are in there, but they can always go back and fix that as well. Then from that, they can really go crazy and get inside of it and start changing emission factors. If they actually have emission studies on their compressor stations, they can go in and modify the emission factors for their compressor stations. If they don't have to mess with this section. They can skip over it, but it allows for full modification of everything that they want to do. Then we start spitting out a mitigation plan based on the best practices from all over the world. The tool will spit out what you could achieve if you applied those best practices to your country. You can then dig into that and see specifically, okay, I'm on pneumatic devices, and what's the control requirement for my pneumatic devices? What does this mean going from high bleed pneumatics to low bleed? What does it mean going high bleed to zero bleed? It allows you to dig in deeply to see what you are getting for your emission reductions, where your biggest bang for your buck might be. Again, it will have a policy library so you can see where the source of these best practices are from, and you can get a sense of what other countries and some national governments have done. Some places are on their 4th or 5th round of regulations. They've learned a lot from this process. So Colorado, for instance, in the United States is on its 5th round of regulations at this point. That's not because they love to regulate, it's because they've learned things over the course of the years, and they've developed better and better regulations. And so COMAT will allow them to dig in to see what other countries, other subnational governments have done. All of this is in the works. It's not ready yet. We're looking to start the launch with the initial first couple of countries next year. And then we'll be expanding that rapidly throughout 2023. But we're really excited to get going and working with countries all around the world. So I am done. I'm going to transition now to EDF and Dan. So you want to come on up, and I will leave you be. There's that.
Thank you, Jonathan. Exciting stuff that Clean Air Task Force is up to as usual. My name is Dan Grossman. I work for EDF. I'm our Associate Vice President for Energy Transition. I'm from Colorado in the United States that Jonathan just mentioned. I worked on the initial methane rules back in 2014, and to see how far the methane conversation has come since then is really remarkable. This is my first COP, and it's quite overwhelming, as I'm sure it is for many of you. But what's so gratifying is that so many folks are talking about methane, not just as a huge problem, but as a great opportunity, as Jonathan mentioned, to really get at climate action. Caveat, not a scientist. I'm a lawyer and an advocate. I'm going to talk a little bit about our methane SAT in a moment, but I just don't want you to be disappointed when we get there when I don't have the rocket science input that Jonathan referenced a moment ago. So one of the things that we're struggling with in the advocacy world, is that better? Clearly I have to learn how to hold a microphone. One of the things that we struggle with in the advocacy world is how to get the most emissions out of the air at the least cost, because that's what makes regulations and policy effective, and it's what makes them durable. If we just make them so that they are driving people out of business, we're not accomplishing what we need to do. So finding that balance is key. And one of the things that EDF has learned since back in 2014 until now is that the way we measure methane, and when I say we, I mean the people who are charged by statute or regulation to measure this, is wrong. And it's wrong by underestimations. And the reason why is because Jonathan mentioned emissions factors. These are old tools that engineers devised over the years to determine how much particular parts emit pollution when they're functioning properly. What they don't account for is when they're not functioning properly, and they don't really account for updates in the way that they're used or in the way that they operate. And so what we found over time in all of our studies, and not just our studies, but other people's studies as well, when we do direct measurement, And that can be people going out with infrared cameras in trucks, or it can be drone flights, or it can be plane overflights. What we're finding is direct measurements are telling us that these are drastically underestimated by regulators, including the US EPA. In the US, our estimate is about 60% underreported. In Canada, it's about half, probably more. And so the biggest problem with that is not just that we don't have a good idea of what the actual emissions picture is, it makes the reductions that we're estimating that we're getting out of the air illusory. Because really, what are you reducing if you can't accurately measure it in the first place? Fortunately, regulators are starting to come around to this, and we're starting to see progress. Back in my home state of Colorado, for example, where they've been using emissions factors for as long as the agency has been around, they're starting to look at, well, they already adopted a performance standard. In addition to their very strong work practice standards, a performance standard, by contrast, is where operators are required to meet a methane intensity standard. But again, if you're relying on emissions factors, you're not really accomplishing anything. So what we're trying to do in Colorado with a lot of Jonathan's colleagues is push the agency to use empirical data and overflights in order to verify emissions in order to demonstrate compliance with the with the performance standard in Colorado. Also, US EPA has recognized that they've got a problem as well, and so we saw Congress directing EPA to change the way that they're measuring when they adopted the Inflation Reduction Act recently, which included a direction to EPA to say you need to start using empirical data, and you need to start having accurate measurement of emissions so that we can actually do a methane fee program that makes sense. And make no mistake, it will help in other ways as well, but especially if you're going to have a methane fee program that creates a charge on excessive emissions, you better be accurately measuring those emissions. There's a 2-year deadline now for EPA to come up with a rule that will implement this directive from Congress. We're hopeful that that will be much, much faster because they've already started work on it. And so that's what we're pushing for. And then finally in Canada, where Jonathan and I also do a lot of work, the Environment and Climate Change Agency in Canada is looking at ways to improve its inventory by incorporating data from studies that EDF has done and that other academics have done as well. So there's progress, and that's good news. One of the challenges is that there are a lot of folks out there who claim to have solved the problem with regards to direct measurement of methane emissions. And it's great because we're seeing this proliferation of technology and methodologies that's really advancing the ball of measuring methane emissions. A word of caution, none of it's a silver bullet. All of these solutions have to be used together, and a matrix approach is really what works best. And when I say matrix, we need to have methods that start at the ground up, actually measuring emissions from particular facilities. We have to have the top down, which folks like carbon mappers and others are providing. And we have to have that reconciliation between the two, again, so that we have a good understanding, an accurate understanding of where emissions are. But without standards, this is just a lot of guesswork, not guesswork. There's enough variability in it that, again, we're not getting the assurances of reductions that we need, accuracy and reductions that we need. And so what we really do need is a comprehensive reporting framework that's going to apply to everybody, something that's technology neutral, something that just has principles about measurement and reporting. And that's why EDF is so excited about the UNEP's program, OGMP 2.0. For those of you who don't know, OGMP stands for the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, and it's something that is creating this kind of technology neutral, rigorous reporting framework that will help move the ball with regards to how regulators are counting emissions and how operators are actually reporting them to the agencies that regulate them. So I think I covered all of this already. It's pushing operators to base their reporting on actual measurements, and that's a big change for a lot of operators, but we're seeing them embrace it. I think close to 100 companies now have signed up for OGMP 2.0, and that means they're on a track to actually do physical measurement of their emissions and report them in a rigorous manner to OGMP, and then hopefully where we're going is that regulators, whether it be EPA, the European Commission, other places, will start requiring this as part of their reporting. It has to be comprehensive. We can't allow operators to just cherry pick particular assets and say, look how great our emissions are. We really need to have a full picture. But OGMP is really going in the right direction. You all may have heard in week 1 of COP, I was comfortably in my home in Colorado when this happened, but the announcement of the joint declaration with the US and Europe and Japan about creating buyers and sellers commitments to reduce methane emissions. And this is really important because it is starting for the first time to leverage the power of buyers of natural gas to demand accountability from the sellers. And the best way to be able to do that is to have some certainty about what sellers are claiming their methane footprint is. A standard like OGMP is going to be critical so that these sellers of gas can credibly demonstrate that they've done everything they can to reduce methane emissions. In the meantime, the work practice standards that I mentioned earlier are going to be critical. We may not know exactly how much leak detection and repair is going to reduce emissions, but we know that it's going to reduce emissions. And so continuing to press for strong leak detection and repair in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, and elsewhere is going to be critical. And so we can't use this thing, well, OGMP hasn't been implemented yet, we need to wait to be able to do a performance standard. No. We need to continue to put pressure on industry to drive down their emissions using work practice standards. The last thing that I'll mention, as you look at this cute polar bear struggling on an iceberg, is that as part of this great development of technology, we're starting to see more proliferation of the use of satellites as a way to help us both detect emissions, and there will be an announcement, I think later this week, about an international cooperation around large event methane emissions and cooperation in using these satellites to detect those early so that we can get them fixed and get on top of them. But on a day-to-day basis, using satellite data to get a better picture of where methane emissions are occurring in the supply chain and directing attention of operators in industry, of regulators, again, so that we can more quickly address those emissions. EDF is working on launching its own satellite. It's called Methane Sat. It will be launched in April 2023, with the first data becoming available in early 2024. We anticipate that this is going to fit nicely because of exactly the way that it's calibrated and the technology that we're using on our satellite in an ecosystem of satellites that are doing similar things. You'll hear more about carbon mappers in a moment, but EDF is focusing on quantifying emissions, and we're kind of in the middle of the pack as far as granularity. So we're looking at large but not quite large areas. So on the one end of the spectrum, you'll have the Tripoli satellite, for example, that has very large scale granularity and is good at kind of pointing out problems in particular basins, for example, or particular countries. Then you have carbon mappers, which is much more granular. It can even get to source attribution, I think, but we'll hear more about that in a moment. Methane Sat is going to be in the middle there. We're going to be looking at particular oil fields, for example, where problems are occurring, where we know that there are particular operators in that field that have the capability to get out and fix leaks quickly. So we're hoping that that Methane Sat, along with carbon mappers, along with the Tripoli satellite, will continue to help individual operators get a better idea of where their problem areas are, and when they have big problems, to be able to fix them quickly. Sorry, I don't have any rocket science behind it. There are much smarter people at EDF who can talk about that, but we're pretty excited about that effort as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Rocket scientists are really smart, and I think that's probably why they're not here at COP, So, sorry to any rocket scientists in the room. Raise your hand if you're a rocket scientist. I know you're not a rocket scientist, Kate. No, I really, one of the things you just mentioned, this issue of like we often hear, the data thing. Oh, it's like if as soon as we get these measurements, then we can act. And I think you're absolutely right. It's like we have to. There are things that are no-brainers in all aspects of methane, whether it's the oil and gas sector or the waste sector. We know if you do leak detection and repair, you're going to get emission reductions. So just start doing leak detection and repair. In the organics sector, we know if you do organics diversion, you're going to get a emission reduction. So there are things that are no-brainers that we can do now that start to reduce emissions while the data improves. So I think that's a really important point, but thank you. And now,
also
carbon
not
mapper.
a rocket scientist, so I'm
But you
smart.
get to hang out with a lot of them.
Yeah, probably a little closer than Dan. But they're in Pasadena, so not, but emotionally.
Does anybody actually hang out together anymore? It's all virtual
No, they
anyways.
don't. Yeah, so it's proximity by wires, I think. Hi everybody. I'm Kenzie Huffman. I'm the Director of Strategy and Partnerships at Carbon Mapper. So it's lovely to talk to you all today. I know, I'm sorry, I'm not a rocket scientist, but I do work for a couple of former ones, so that is close enough. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about, who Carbon Mapper is and what we've been seeing with some of our airborne data, and then talk a little bit about the satellites and what we will be doing going forward. So a little bit more on who we are. So Carbon Mapper is a nonprofit, and we are focused on delivering actionable and accessible methane and CO2 data at the point source scale. To do this, we do use remote sensing technologies to detect, pinpoint, and quantify methane and CO2 emissions at the scale of individual facilities. So Dan was not wrong. And to do this, we lead this really unique public-private partnership. And it is philanthropically powered, and it brings together a lot of different expertise and skill sets to tackle a lot of these big gaps that we've been talking about today in the measurement and monitoring space. So some of our main partners are NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, so they're the rocket scientists, the satellite company Planet, the California Air and Resources Board, RMI, and many others, as you can see on the slide. And the goal is to develop and deploy a constellation of methane detecting satellites. And so right now we're in the process of what we call phase 1, and that's us where we're building and planning to launch 2 satellites in the fall of next year. And then the goal is to expand that to a full constellation, which would provide much more frequent measurement and monitoring. And one of the other unique elements about our public-private partnership is that all of the methane and CO2 data that we'll be collecting will be publicly available. And so it is incredibly important, and we've heard this all week at COP, or week and a half, that transparency is really critical to driving action, and that is one of our core principles. So I thought I would take a quick step back to talk a little bit about the landscape, and Dan alluded to this. But there's a lot of emerging tools and technologies in the measurement and monitoring space, and we're seeing them all come in. It's amazing, and it's so fun to see everything come around, but they're all addressing different parts of the methane measurement and monitoring question. And this is really what Dan was getting at. There's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And at the highest level, we think about this in kind of 2 different buckets. And so some of these technologies are built to address or support things like aggregate accounting and inventories, and others are more suited to support things like direct mitigation guidance. So this is local and facility level data. But in order to address both of these types, you need a portfolio of technologies and approaches. So this includes ground-based and airborne and satellites, and you really need this suite of technologies, or what we call a system of systems, to address this. And there really isn't one technology, as Dan said, that can answer all of these questions. So it's essential that we all know this, but I think we've made the point. But despite this emerging ecosystem and all of these actors focusing on different parts of this puzzle and all of these gaps, a number of gaps do still remain. So in particular, trust in the data. There's still a lot of questions around that. Capacity of stakeholders to use the data. And scaling and sustaining these technologies in order to keep up the monitoring and measurement frequency. And Carbon Mapper was built to focus on addressing many of these gaps. And particularly in the context of the second type of monitoring, which is direct mitigation guidance. So we're really focused at this point source scale. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's what we're focused on. So our satellites are optimized to be able to detect these high emission point sources. And the reason that that's what we focused on was because what we have seen through a number of different studies is that a small amount of infrastructure can actually contribute between 20 and 60% of regional emissions. And this is sometimes infrastructure that's less than 1%. And so when you are able to identify a handful of these high emitting sources, you can lead to some really real reductions really quickly if you're able to get the data to the operator or to the actor and actually drive mitigation. We've also found that all of these high emission point sources occur in a lot of the major methane emitting sectors. So oil and gas, coal, waste, agriculture, and addressing them can also do a lot to improve public health. So that's a little bit of why that's what our focus is. And here's just a little bit of a brief example of some of the imagery and the data that we collect and produce. And so this is an example of how integrating high resolution imagery with the emission detection and quantification can really do a lot to help drive mitigation action on the ground. It can help to identify where the source is coming from. It can also provide more information around the root cause of those sources. And then that ultimately will do more to guide that mitigation for the operators of those on the ground. And so this data is actually really localized. It's really at the facility scale. And so what can it be used for to drive mitigation action? There's actually a lot more than just direct guidance. So I talked about that, and that's leak detection and repair. But it can also inform best practices and prioritize investments for sectors where emissions are still less well measured or understood, so waste and agriculture in particular. It can support supply chain intensity, validation, and verification, so a lot of some of the work that MIQ is doing. It can help identify policy and regulatory gaps. It can inform and improve inventory estimates, and it can empower communities and inform public health. And so what does this all look like in practice? So this is a little bit of an example of what we're seeing in the field. So we conduct a number of ongoing airborne surveys as we build up to the satellites. And what we have generally found is that operators, when they have access to actionable data, many will actually take voluntary action. And so, one example that we have is we've conducted a number of surveys in California. So we've been surveying since 2016. And this includes a number of different sites from oil and gas production to natural gas pipelines to landfills. And here are about 20 examples in Southern California where operators, when they were given the data, they worked really closely and in partnership with the regulator and California Air and Resources Board to work with the data, and they used it to pinpoint the emissions, to verify using service measurements that the emissions were what they said they were, and then repair those leaking equipment. And that actually led to a significant amount of reductions, and that was all voluntary. And Carbon Mapper conducted overflights afterwards, and so we were able to verify that the emissions had actually been reduced. And while this was a small pilot in California, it does demonstrate that there's a lot of power in having access to this type of data, and it can really do a lot to drive action. And if you actually build on that with incentives and policy, there's a lot more that can be done. That being said, there are a lot of challenges here. One of the biggest ones is actually, as we've talked about many times, getting the data into the right hands. And we call it the handoff challenge. But essentially, with all the different jurisdictions, all those different agencies that have ownership over different parts of it, it's also hard to attribute to different operators. And so you don't exactly know who to notify, even if you have the data. And so this is where efforts like what IMEO was doing with the Methane Alert Response Program that they announced earlier this week, or last week, is really, really critical to starting to address this. And they are doing it at a global scale, which is necessary and also even more complex. So it's incredibly good to have that kind of program starting to get spun up. And this is also why Carbon Mapper works with partners like Clean Air Task Force and RMI to get this data into the right regional and industry partners' hands. And so a little bit on looking forward. So there's been a lot of great conversation around waste in the last couple of weeks, and which is really necessary because it's been an underemphasized sector on the methane front. for a while now. 18% of human caused methane comes from waste, and it's something that Carbon Mapper is especially focused on in the near term. And so it was really exciting because today we actually did announce a new Carbon Mapper initiative to develop a global baseline assessment of high emission waste sites. And so with support from the Grantham Foundation, we will be leveraging data from NASA's EMIT mission. We will be expanding our airborne surveys and then using data from our satellites once they're launched to develop this baseline. And this work will dramatically scale up insight into upwards of 10,000 waste sites globally. And we also plan to build and work on efforts underway that have also been announced at COP. So RMI recently announced a wonderful program, Waste Map, which will be leveraging a lot of the data that we'll be using to actually help get the data and translate it to where policymakers and decision makers can actually do things with it. And then we'll also continue to work with other partners to get it, into the hands of those in different jurisdictions and regions. And so it's really exciting. And so, I'll just wrap up to say that, there are a lot of emerging tools and remote sensing technologies that are out there. And the exciting thing is that they're actually going to be providing unprecedented visibility into methane emissions. And so we're going to be having so much data that we don't know what to do with, and that is why having these conversations about driving action is really, really critical to get to us to figure out how to make the data as actionable as possible to guide decisions in the near term. So thank you.
Thank you, Kenzie. The visibility piece is kind of it has multiple meanings in this case because you're bringing visibility to it. But one of the reasons that visibility has to come to this issue is because, frankly, methane's invisible. I mean, when you look at a coal-fired power plant, you know when something's going wrong. And when you get soot landing on your doorstep, you know something really is going wrong. It's always been easier to advocate around diesel engines or coal-fired power plants or anything like that because people look out their front door or they drive down the road or whatever and they see the pollution coming from those sources. But if you drive by a gas facility, unless it's flaring, there's no sense that it's a problem. You look out there and you're like, oh, it looks pretty good to me. You look through, one of the airplanes that Carbon Mapper has or, one of the OGI cameras or through the satellites, and you see a completely different picture. But that actual visibility of methane is visibility to policymakers and actors in this space to raise awareness and to force them to take action because before it was so easy to ignore. So thank you. And with that, Laura.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Hutchinson. I am a manager with RMI's Climate Aligned Industries program, and here representing our climate intelligence team, specifically Deborah Gordon and Frances Royland, who are responsible for much of this incredible work on methane that we've done over the past couple years. So I'll start out with kind of raising us back to why we're here and why this is important and why managing methane from the oil and gas sector, but also from other sectors, is a critical near-term opportunity as well as necessary step for us to take in the energy transition. I won't dwell on this too much, but in effect, we're not on track to meet our climate targets, and methane plays a massive role in that. It's more than 80 times as potent as CO2 on a 20-year basis, as Jonathan emphasized. And so we have a significant opportunity to abate this in the very near term, especially with more data, more action, more tools that can support better decision-making on this topic. And oil and gas, whether we like it or not, remains a part of the energy mix in every decarbonization scenario. And while we transition to cleaner and newer sources of energy, both liquid and electrifying all of our uses of energy, we still have an obligation to make oil and gas operations as efficient as possible from a methane emission standpoint. Methane is natural gas. Every ounce of methane that we leak is a climate pollutant. Making our oil and gas system as efficient as possible is to all of our advantage as we transition to other fuels. So bringing us back to global methane emission sources, oil and gas comprises about a quarter of our methane emissions footprint as a society. There are several others. Much of the work that this panel discussed today and can and should apply to these other sectors in addition to oil and gas. The same level of information that we collect about methane emissions from the oil and gas sector can also be of great use to landfill methane, other sources of methane in our society. And as Kenzie emphasized, we, in a different session earlier today, announced our waste map or waste methane assessment platform project in collaboration with the Global Methane Hub and the Clean Air Task Force with Jonathan. So we're really excited about sharing some of these lessons with the waste sector as well as continuing our work on oil and gas specifically. Back to oil and gas. The oil and gas sector is the #1 source of CO2 and the #1 source of methane in the world. There's a ton of opportunity to make oil and gas production much more efficient in terms of emissions intensity as we, again, transition away from these fuels over time. So what is RMI doing on oil and gas and on methane in particular? We have a plethora of programs that tackle this issue in a number of different ways. Today, I'll focus primarily on one, our Oil Climate Index plus Gas Project, or OCI plus. But our work spans a couple different objectives. The first is making oil and gas emissions visible. As Dan and other panelists emphasize, these emissions are invisible to the human eye, so we need technologies, we need models, we need all of these tools in our toolkit to address and see these emissions. So we're in partnership with Carbon Mapper, and we're working on other approaches to see and scale our knowledge of what's fundamentally happening, what needs to be abated. We're also doing another level up. It's not enough to just visualize and measure these emissions. We need to translate that into something tangible that the world can do something about. So we're doing that with the OCI Plus model and with MIQ, a differentiated methane emissions standard, which has an independent framework for evaluating any batch of natural gas that's produced with respect to several quality indicators. The first being a methane intensity estimation, the second being a holistic view of company practices that are consistent with methane emissions management, and the third being monitoring technology deployment, including satellites, but also smaller scale and on-site measurement. So we're tackling this problem at a number of different scales and a number of different levels to hopefully give the world a clearer picture of what they're dealing with. So diving into a bit of detail on the OCI Plus model, this is an open source tool that's available on the internet right now. You can look it up. It's a labor of love that came from academia, that came from a number of NGOs, working with industry, working with policymakers over a number of years to construct something that we hoped could really channel data from a myriad of sources and influence action to abate these emissions. It's built from a baseline of several peer-reviewed engineering models, OPG from Stanford, Prelim from University of Calgary, and OPEM from RMI that all target different segments of the oil and gas supply chain. And these data sources are kind of the core of the model, but satellite data and other measured data is used in complement to these models to give us a clearer picture of what could be physically happening, but also what is happening more stochastically, more randomly, that we can only see from a top-down perspective. So the OCI Plus also incorporates measured data from satellites and from field studies to give us a kind of more holistic top-down and bottom-up picture of what's happening and what can be abated. There's a couple of analytical tools within this platform as well, which are really interesting. For example, one that you see here is a shadow price tool that can be applied to methane emissions, kind of like a carbon tax, but specifically for methane. And what you're seeing here is across all of these basins in the world and by segment of those supply chains, what we would see as a potential methane fee and how emissions could be abated, kind of a marginal abatement cost curve in this diagram. So we see there's a lot of opportunity to use different types of analytical approaches with respect to this data in this platform and across other platforms. So what is RMI working on now? What are we seeing next? Through our partnership, our collaboration with Climate Trace, which is a global coalition of NGOs and other actors that are compiling what we think is the largest data set of open access emissions in the world. We just recently, I believe last week, announced a facility level view of global emissions data, including oil and gas basin level information that's distributed by greenhouse gas specifically, so methane is highlighted within this. We were able to pinpoint and rank methane emissions as well as emissions more broadly by every basin in the world, and simultaneously highlight the scale of those emissions with respect to emissions from other sectors and other facilities, which is a really cool thing. Climate Trace is supported by Al Gore, so we're really excited to be in partnership with him and with all of our other partners in that effort. We're also really excited to continue to work very closely with Carbon Mapper to integrate this OCI Plus model and satellite data into a platform that everyone can use and see and make decisions on the back of. And then in general, across all of our partnerships, we're really excited to continue to increase the transparency of this problem, give people the tools to actually understand what they can do about it, and catalyze impact through continuing to talk in forums like this with you all. So with that, I will leave you with this message of hope from our colleagues that we think there are really actionable, cost-effective solutions to make oil and gas as low emitting as possible today as we transition to a zero carbon future. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys. So we have a few minutes still for questions. So if I can keep from getting text messages from all over the COP right now. I'll ask a few questions, then I'll see if anybody in the audience here has any questions. I guess, you know, the first one I would ask is maybe. So one of the things we've seen, there's been a lot of remote sensing work done in the field of, you know, flaring. You know, we've had satellites now for a long time that have been able to see flaring emissions. We've got, you know, tons of data on that. We're still seeing, you know, extensive issues of flaring problems around the world. And flaring, of course, is a big source of methane emissions. You know, as we increase the satellites, the aerial surveys, the on-the-ground surveys, you know, what are the things that you guys see are necessary to move from the data? And data's great, I love data, but like at the end of the day, it's about emission reductions that we have to get to. You know, how do we create that confidence? How do we create that space? And, you know, what are some of the things that, you know, the global community needs to work on to make sure that all the great work that you guys are all doing moves from that data space into that action space? So that's an open question to anybody, so just raise your hand if you want to go first.
I can start with the high-level approach, and then I'll pass to my colleagues for a much more detailed analysis. Really, the implementation options are endless, right? And I think one of the most useful frameworks to think about when we're thinking about, okay, we have this pile of data now, what do we do with it, is who will use it and for what? When we think about oil and gas methane specifically, there's a couple different approaches towards mitigation. There's the stick, there's the carrot, and there's also the who holds the money and provides capital for new projects to come online. So there's an opportunity to translate some of these data into insights that are specific to the finance sector, that are specific to policymakers that are trying to evaluate which parameters to put in new policies, which is already happening and which is really exciting. And there's an opportunity to target specifically buyers of these products and convince them of the need to decrease the level of uncertainty as to their estimates. One of the things that I do in most of my day job these days is thinking about, okay, climates, big companies have set these climate targets and are setting science-based targets or other types of targets about their emissions footprints more broadly. Everyone has oil and gas methane emissions theoretically somewhere within their scope 3 footprint. How do we address those? How do we make sure that within the context of climate disclosure, folks are actually taking into account the uncertainty that we know exists on methane emissions from the oil and gas products that are in their supply chains, and how can we make sure that we're pressuring those companies to hold their suppliers accountable for keeping those methane emissions really small. So that's something that MIQ, for example, is a framework that can support that type of buyer-led intervention. So that's one example.
Kinsey or Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think one big thing I think that is a huge gap is the capacity of stakeholders to use and understand the data. And I think that is something that, there's a lot of data coming, and we need to start figuring out ways to make it as accessible to people as possible. And, I used to actually work in the finance sector, and the data that I see today, they could not use currently. So there needs to be a lot of layers of translation in order to get it ready for them and for action there. And I think there's a lot of momentum. The waste map program that you both are working on is a huge step for the waste sector, and I think there's a lot of other similar ones that are trying to start tackle, or that are thinking about this type of data and actually trying to figure out how to translate it. But I do see that as one of the biggest barriers to action and taking that data and actually doing things with it. And then we talked a little bit about the handoff challenge, but that's another big one, is just figuring out, there are a large number of people that actually do know how to use this data, but just they don't know where the data, that the data exists. And so that's another huge gap. And I think, I mentioned, IMEO and MethaneStat, I think, is contributing to that. And there's just a lot of groups that are going to be contributing into these systems that are starting to think about aggregating and sorting for these different use cases, and that's going to be really important.
I'm glad you brought this up, Jonathan, because one thing that I personally and EDF feels very strongly about is that voluntary actions are great, but they're never a substitute for a baseline regulatory structure that drives down emissions. It's just not a substitute, and we've learned that lesson over and over and over again. It doesn't mean that we stop trying. We definitely want to establish an incentive program for leaders in this area to do the right thing and give them the tools to be able to do the right thing. We want to push investors to make smart decisions about their money, just not on returns on investment from an economic standpoint, but from an environmental and a climate standpoint too. Those are all important. But at the end of the day, my work is about policy decisions that are going to drive down emissions. And the data from where I sit is most powerful and most useful in that context. As I mentioned earlier, Jonathan and I do a lot of work in Canada. And they've done a decent job of passing regulations that they think are driving down emissions across the country. And they have a lot of oil and gas operations in the western part of the country. What we're learning through our science is that they're a little inaccurately oriented. And some of the problem areas that we're seeing based on the studies that we do based on direct measurements are showing a little bit different attributions of where they should be focusing. Venting and flaring, as you mentioned, is a huge problem, much bigger than what some of the other issues that we thought were bigger, like pneumatic pumps and pneumatic devices. And so using that data to be able to go to the regulators and say, you're doing a great job, but if you could make this tweak and you could focus on this little, variation, then you're really going to get a lot more methane bang for your buck. You mentioned flaring. a great example is EDF did this Permian map project where, again, we thought we had a pretty good idea about where emissions were in the Permian. And we were focusing on things like pneumatic devices and leak detection and repair fugitive emissions from well sites. And what we found is that emissions from inefficient and malfunctioning flares dwarfed all those other sources to an extent that actually surprised us. And so now, unfortunately, the Texas Railroad Commission isn't super interested in cracking down on this practice, but EPA is considering getting more serious about the practice of routine flaring. And we've seen the states of Colorado and New Mexico do the same thing. And so the data, again, it's great for voluntary measures. It's great for pushing companies to do robust ESG commitments and actually fulfilling them. But at the end of the day, it's most important and best fodder for policy.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really, really important point here. And a lot of times policymakers want to be able to say, all right, one and done. All right, we just did a methane policy. All right, we're done for 10, 15, 20 years, whatever, and don't ask me to come back to this. But this is one of those issues where it can't be one and done. We're going to have to approach this in a way where let's put something in place, let's start learning by doing, and then let's improve the policy as we go on. And by doing, the data will also be improving as well. So I think that's a really key aspect. You all kind of alluded to this in your remarks as well, and I want to ask this question. Every country that's here at COP has done some sort of greenhouse gas inventory, and as all of this data starts flowing, what we're seeing is it very much contradicts the inventories, and it's never on a lower end of the scale. It's always on a higher end of the scale. You mentioned a couple examples, Dan, when you were talking about emissions in the United States and Canada. You guys also did some work in Mexico where it was a lot more than that. I think everywhere the science is done, we find that emissions are always much larger than what are in the inventory. At some point, with all of this data flowing, when your satellite is up, when your satellites are up, all of this work is being done, there has to start to be a process and a reckoning between the inventories and the data. And I'm wondering, I'm not expecting you to have the perfect answer, but I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts on what that process needs to look like, how we start to bring a semblance of reason to the two things where the data will completely contradict the inventories, and sometimes is a little scary to regulators and the people who control the inventories in countries. The reaction that I've seen in many countries has been like, you're wrong, and we don't want to create a barrier there. So how do we overcome that? How do we start to find that common ground that begins to blend the new data that we're going to have with the inventories?
So I think Kenzie and Laura will have better answers. I can just say that from my perspective, by socializing this idea of incorporating direct measurement into inventories with industry is critical. Not because we're going to expect them to do it as good corporate citizens, but because when the regulators come to them and say, this is how we're going to do business going forward, they don't totally freak out and put a bunch of resources to fight it. I think that the EPA rulemaking coming up to incorporate empirical data will be an interesting test of this theory. But the fact that so many big operators at least are signing up for OGMP 2.0, I think is a good sign that we can make significant progress. But you're right. I mean, in any walk of life, change is hard. And especially when change is ingrained in years and years of practice, and where oil and gas operators have done it this way for so long, it's going to take some impetus to get them to change the way they do business. Our hope is that by making it maybe a little bit less scary, by the work that all three of you are doing, I think will help a lot.
Yeah, I would just say, so, we've done some engagement with states broadly, and not just states that are really, forward thinking on this, but other states that are similar to the other countries, but there's a lot of feeling that direct measurement is saying you're wrong, you're bad, stop. And so what we have found, and you kind of mentioned this, is that engaging early and really approaching it as this is a collaborative way to improve the estimates, not replace, not take away. You're not doing anything wrong, but just make it better, and we can do that collectively, has been a really useful message, but it is really hard to get, it's been hard to get over that knee-jerk reaction. And I also would say that, you know, especially with other countries, one thing that we found, because this is where Climate Trace is doing like aggregate inventories, and Carbon Mapper, because we're focused on the direct guidance, the point source, that's not what we focus on. We can inform estimates and improve them, but we couldn't replace an inventory. And that's really something that we've had a lot of discussion about, which is we can't replace this, and it really never would. And so how to kind of build that collaborative approach to building up and reconciling between the two. And in some ways it kind of always comes down to a comms conversation, but in other ways it is about getting the scientists together and actually saying, we understand how you're measuring this, we understand how this is being measured. Let's talk about the different ways that those measurements came to be, and then have much more of a conversation that I can only understand 10% of, but it's really critical, and that there's a lot of value in that. So that's really what we've found has been really valuable.
Not much to add on top of that, but I'll make two small points. One, I think it's fundamentally a methodology conversation, and the two parameters that you need there are enough actors that are covered by the same types of data sources so that you can make an apples-to-apples comparison. That's hard. Once we get more satellites in the air and more consistent deployment of types of monitoring technologies and frameworks that allow us to see between them, that'll get easier. And we also need some level of marrying and aligning on what the appropriate methodology for that type of disclosure could be. And I'll also build on Kenzie's point about Climate Trace. Climate Trace put out last week a global inventory by country of methane emissions, as well as all emissions for all sectors of the economy for 2020 and 2021, as kind of an example of how this could be done. With open access and open source methodology and tools, you can download the data set on climatetrace.org. Highly encourage folks to take a look at that. And I think that's an example of using both modeled and measured data, how an inventory-based approach could be refined to reflect what's actually happening quicker than typical inventories get put together by countries. We can do this with models, artificial intelligence, satellite data, other sources of data within a year, as opposed to several years later in an emission factor-based manner. So there's opportunity for improvement, for sure.
Great, thank you. I want to turn to the audience. I saw hands start going up, so I'll walk around and let you guys ask questions, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Patrick Bückert, GSZ Germany. So many thanks. Has been really, for me, very informative, this session. I'm not an expert of fossil fuels and the oil and gas sector, but I do have, or I've seen over the last 2 or 3 years that there is an increasing debate about methane emissions from the coal sector as well. So from operating and as well from closed down coal mines. So 2 questions to you. Do you think this is an important subject? And secondly, do you think, if it is, could the tools, the models you have presented, could they actually be used to track down as well methane emissions from the coal sector?
Great question. And Kenzie, are you able to talk about the Canada stuff or not?
No, not yet.
You can't? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Stay tuned for that. She's done some really good work. But I won't bust you now. Yes, the satellites, the aerial work, all of it can see and measure emissions from the coal mines, and there is a lot of, like other methane sources, whether it's ag or waste or oil and gas. There's a lot more emissions than we often thought there was. I don't know if Dan, have you guys have done some coal mine work too? Yeah.
Yeah, we have, and I'll just use China as an example. Coal mine methane in China dwarfs oil and gas methane, which was shocking to me, but it's absolutely true. And it's a little bit more centralized than oil and gas facilities, right? Because oil and gas methane can be over an entire field or can be over an entire basin, whereas coal mine methane is more centralized. So the measurement is maybe a little less critical that it be so granular as it is in the oil and gas realm. But it's still critical for us to know when they're leaking and how we can address it. And it's a little bit different in Europe and in the U.S., but it's a significant source everywhere. But I was really surprised to find out it was such a huge source in China.
Yeah, and if you look at the global graphs of methane emissions from coal mines, China is over here on this side, and the rest of the world is over here. It's a massive issue. So definitely need to deal with it. Laura, did you want to say something on coal mines before I take another question?
I'll just add one small point. I think from memory from that chart that I showed earlier, we can pull it back up, but it's on the order of 10% of global methane emissions from coal mines. And I'll just tell a personal anecdote. I live in a little town called Carbondale in Colorado, and it's an old coal mining town, and there's a lot of abandoned coal mines in the hills around where I live. And I've gone out and measured methane emissions from those sites. In some contexts, it's a similar challenge to the waste sector, in that a lot of these sites are abandoned and no longer measured or managed. So there certainly a lot of the same tools apply, but it in some ways may be a similar challenge to the waste sector in terms of approach.
Great, thank you.
Mahmoud Abu Naga with Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a question regarding the technologies that are allowed or permitted to be used for detection of methane emissions. Like we have seen the EPA open the door for multiple technologies. Do you think a technology inclusive approach like that can be sometimes not effective in reducing the emissions? And I'm asking that because most of the existing technologies at the facility level use like a VOC analyzer, volatile organic compound analyzer, and this works only when you have a wet gas well. When you have a dry gas well. But if you have a wet gas well, they can't actually detect methane, but they are allowed because it's a technology inclusive approach. And that goes back to your point about why the inventory is always less when you do the cloud imaging or the laser imaging, because the inventory method depends on an outdated technology that we still allow facility owners or operators to use. Thank you.
Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I'll do it at a high level now, let Dan actually get, because it's like, this is your expertise. But I would just say broadly, one of the things that's really interesting about Carbon Mapper's approach and our technology is that those are the kind of emissions that we'll be able to see and pinpoint and inform policy to say these technologies are approved or whatever, but if they aren't actually reducing methane emissions, then we can actually start showing that, and that'll actually really inform the policy making and the understanding of what works and what doesn't. We see this a lot with dairy digesters, for example. Not that when they work, they work. When they don't work, they don't work. And so we can see that and really help to inform either the maintenance of those technologies or the implementation of better technologies. And so that is actually one application of the Carbon Mapper data.
It's a great question, and it's something that in the policy realm we struggle with, right? Because on the one hand, we don't want to lock in a technology into a regulation, which is exactly what we did in Colorado in 2014. We said you can use an OGI camera or you can use a sniffer device, a PID device, and left it at that. And so what that does is it creates, as technologies develop and there are more sophisticated ways of doing it, they're locked out. And so one of the first, when we went back, one of the several times we've gone back to review the Colorado regs, is we tried to make it a little bit more flexible and say we're less concerned about the specific technology that you're using, but if you're going to use something other than an OGI camera, other than a PID device, you have to demonstrate to the agency that it's at least as effective in detecting methane emissions than what we've identified already. Which sounds great, right? But the problem with that then becomes, in a policy realm, how can I put this politely? They're not always guided just by the science. They can be guided by other factors like lobbying and money and other things and exigency and things like that. And so what we worry about is that in some circumstances where we're acceding to a flexible standard, you just mentioned the EPA rule, which is a great example, you immediately start seeing companies come forward and say, our technology, should be approved by EPA to do this. And instead of demonstrating it with robust science, demonstrating it through high intensity lobbying, I guess is a nice way to put it. And so it's a tricky dance. We want to make sure that we're not locking in technologies and putting any kind of a damper on innovation. On the other hand, we need to make sure that regulators are holding these companies to a very high standard so that the demonstrations are transparent and objective, and that we can say, yeah, that's good enough. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in the EPA context is using an advanced screening process where you're using overflights like Carbon Mapper in conjunction with at least some ground level monitoring. At what frequency does that have to occur to be equivalent? And that's something that the agency is going to be working on, and something that EDF and I'm sure Carbon Mappers is going to be very interested in as well.
Yeah, Kenzie, you mentioned a system of systems, I think is what you called it, and that seems to be where the future of leak detection and repair is headed, because it's not a case of, use this technology. It's use these technologies, and how do we find that semblance of where we get the best performance out of those technologies? And so, Laura, did you want to jump in here, or?
I just had a quick suggestion. If you're keen on kind of the details of technology comparisons, there's a group out of Colorado State University called the METEC, the Methane Emissions Technology Evaluation Center, and they do a lot of really robust research and vetting of a lot of technologies in terms of what they say they're able to achieve by methane detection limit and all these other critical parameters, which can help us better understand what works for what application. So that's one of many groups doing really important work in this area to help us understand applications of various technologies.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yvan Champagne, Chief Carbon Officer with Carbon AI, based out of Calgary, Alberta, and Dubai. I wanted to first off say congratulations and thank you to Clean Air Task Force, EDF, and RMI. You guys have done a ton of great work on the policy side, bringing attention to what is a really, really important issue. And then for the additional stuff that's being done on the satellite side for making the invisible visible, which is a really, really important part of the solution. I didn't want to ask a question, but I wanted to make a few observations that I think are really important. For context, prior to my current role, I designed and ran one of the largest methane reduction programs ever executed in Canada in the Alberta oil and gas sector, replacing and retrofitting pneumatic devices. I don't know if you remember, Jonathan, but we had a briefing, I think it was probably 4 years ago when we had started doing the program. Quick highlight, we ended up inventorying about 50,000 pneumatic devices, replacing about 12,500 with 40 different oil and gas companies. We did it over about a 36-month period, twice our objective. I think we were supposed to do about 6,000, we ended up doing 12,000. Part of why we were able to do that is, Alberta had introduced a new regulatory framework, some new targets by 2025 to higher standards, eliminating high bleed pneumatic devices. But there was another piece of magic in Alberta that allowed us to do what we did, which is the use of markets. And so an early action period incentive, which we were able to take advantage of and drive as a greenhouse gas project development firm to really change behavior. And I think it's something that's really important as I look out. So what we do now at Carbon AI is all of the tools, applications we use to deliver that program, chasing and solving a problem on some of the smallest sources of methane emissions. We're doing the same thing internationally in Africa and the Middle East on some of the largest sources, flares. And what's missing right now We've got the great science. Like I'm old enough to remember when methane had a 100-year GWP of 17. We're at 34 now. You absolutely pointed out that on a 20-year basis, we're up to, what, 86? It is a massive issue. But what we're missing right now to allow markets to really deliver what they can is demand. And so if we look at what some of the large, very influential U.S. environmental groups have done and done a great job on, is create demand for emission reductions in nature-based solutions. And there's a fantastic pull for that. There's less demand from large voluntary buyers for things like methane reductions in the oil and gas sector. It's just not as sexy. But I'll tell you what, in terms of impact, this is probably some of the most important stuff. And think of how influential your groups are with large corporates, with government, to try to create a pull and demand to allow this problem to be solved, which I think it really can be right now. That's a tremendous opportunity. And I'd be happy to share any kind of advice and stuff we've done if it'll be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. There for a second, I thought you said that briefing was 40 years ago, and I was like, no. I'm old, but not that old. So, any comments? No, thank you. Other questions? Yep. Oh.
Thanks. You said that the use of emission factors typically results in a large underestimate of methane emissions. Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay. This question's specifically for you. So is the idea then for COMAT to be a stand-in for direct measurements that would be phased out as measurement data availability grows, or would it be a complement to direct measurement?
Great question. We see COMAT is something that evolves over time, but it's definitely not a substitute for direct measurements. It is, think of it as paramedics at the scene of an accident. Right now, these guys are doing some kick-butt science work and getting satellites and aerial measurements and all of that stuff going. COMAT is something we can do right now while all of that starts to flow in. As the data starts to come from methane sat, as the data starts to come from Carbon Mapper, all of that will provide a lot more information. But we don't have that much time between now and 2030, and that's our target for getting a 30% reduction in methane emissions. So COMAT fills a gap right now to bring about the ability to take action right now. Goes back to something we were talking about with leak detection and repair, or organics diversion in the waste sector. It's like, these are things we know we can do right now to reduce emissions. COMAT gives us that ability to have just enough confidence in where our emissions are and how we can design that first initial policy to start reducing them. And as Dan was talking about, we're going to learn a lot as we go along, because every policy that you put in place to reduce emissions will teach you a lot about what's going on in that country, and we have to be willing to go back and adapt them. So I look at it as like the paramedics and the ambulance, coming in and, hopefully get us started and keep us alive for a little while till we can get the rest of the emissions taken care of. All right, any last questions? We have time one more, or we can close out here. Awesome. I would love to thank you guys. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you all coming by, and I hope you have a wonderful COP for the remaining, we have 3 more days. Sorry. Two? It's Wednesday. Oh, yeah, but the days are really long. Wednesday's not over. Thank you all.